In the final, fading years, a member of Elvis Presley's inner circle was fired, not for theft, not for betrayal, but for a simple, human act. He took a single weekend off to visit his ailing mother without first securing the king's permission. He was excommunicated. This was the chilling reality of the unwritten law, the silent vow that bound a handful of men to the most famous person on earth. So was this absolute, unwavering loyalty to a beloved friend? Or was it something far more sinister? The cold, calculated conspiracy of well-paid jailers, tasked with guarding the secrets of a man and an empire, slowly coming apart at the seams? The air inside Graceland was different after midnight. It grew heavy, thick with the scent of cigar smoke, stale perfume, and the low hum of an air conditioner fighting a losing battle against the oppressive Memphis heat. The laughter, the music, the chaos of the day would recede, leaving behind a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. It was the sound of men on duty. They were called the Memphis Mafia, a name given to them by a press that saw only the dark suits, the sunglasses, the swagger of Southern boys orbiting a Sun King. They were his friends. They were his employees. They were his brothers, his fixers, his shield, and they were never allowed to leave. It hadn't started that way. In the beginning, back in the 1950s, it was pure, unadulterated camaraderie. It was a band of brothers, fresh from the hard-scrabble streets of Memphis, suddenly swept up in a hurricane of fame they couldn't possibly comprehend. They were the buffer between Elvis and a world that wanted to tear him apart, piece by piece. They drove the cars, answered the phones, and took the punches, both literal and figurative. The vow, in those early days, was an unspoken promise, born of genuine affection. We've got your back, always. But fame is a corrosive acid. It burns away at the edges of everything pure, leaving behind a harder, more cynical core. As the years bled into one another, as the 1950s gave way to the gilded cage of Hollywood and the suffocating glitz of Las Vegas, the nature of their bond began to warp. The promise of friendship became a prerequisite of employment. The camaraderie became a contract, paid in Cadillacs and diamond rings, but signed with the ink of personal freedom. The unspoken vow solidified into an unbreakable rule. Never leave the king alone. Not for an hour. Not for a minute. Not to go to the store. Not to see your wife. Not to attend your own father's funeral. The stories are legend, whispered in backrooms and confessed in memoirs decades after the fact. Alan Fortas, one of the core members, received a call that his father was dying. He went to Elvis, his friend, his boss, to ask for permission to go home. Elvis, lost in his own world, surrounded by the noise and the sycophants, waved him away. Not now. The king's needs came first. Always. Fortas waited, a man torn between two worlds, until the second call came. It was too late. His father was gone. This was the price of admission to the court of the king. It was a court built on a foundation of profound, terrifying loneliness. Rehook. The world saw the entourage, the constant party, the endless parade of bodies filling the halls of Graceland. But what the cameras never captured was the suffocating emptiness at the center of it all. Elvis Presley, the man who could command the adoration of millions with a sneer of his lip, was pathologically terrified of silence. He was terrified of being by himself. The presence of the mafia was his shield against the one enemy he could never conquer, his own thoughts in an empty room. He paid for noise. He paid for distraction. He paid for the illusion of family. Their duties were simple, yet all-encompassing. Someone had to be awake at all hours, because the king's body clock was a twisted wreck, his days and nights inverted. If Elvis awoke at 4 in the afternoon, his day began. If he wanted to watch a movie at 3 in the morning, the private theater was opened, and the boys took their seats. If he had a sudden whim to rent out the entire Memphis fairgrounds to ride the roller coaster at dawn, they made the calls and drove the cars. They were his 24-hour-a-day playmates. But children's games can turn dark. The vow wasn't just about companionship. It was about control. Control for Elvis, who needed a universe that revolved entirely around his own whims. And control for another, far more shadowy figure who loomed over the entire operation: Colonel Tom Parker. The colonel saw the Memphis Mafia not as friends, but as assets. They were the handlers, the wranglers, the men tasked with ensuring the prize bull was always ready for the show. Parker understood Elvis's psychology better than anyone. He knew that to isolate the man was to control the product. The boys became the walls of Elvis's prison. A comfortable prison, to be sure, with shag carpets and custom cars, but a prison nonetheless. They were there to keep the outside world out, to filter the information he received, to manage the women who came and went with heartbreaking frequency. They were the gatekeepers of the king's reality, and that reality was becoming more and more detached from the real world with every passing year. Red West, one of the original members, a man who had known Elvis since they were teenagers, felt the shift more acutely than anyone. He was the tough guy, the bodyguard, the one who took a punch for his friend without a second thought. But the lines blurred until they vanished completely. One moment, they'd be laughing, reminiscing about high school. Two poor boys from Memphis who'd conquered the world. The next, Elvis's mood would snap. His eyes would flash with a cold fire, and he would remind them, with a terrifying suddenness, who paid the bills. He wasn't just their friend. He was their employer, their provider, their king, and the king's moods were law. Rehook. But the vow had another, darker purpose. A secret function that went beyond fending off loneliness or managing the whims of a star. The Memphis Mafia were not just companions. They were keepers of the secrets. They were the men who cleaned up the messes, who smoothed over the rough edges, who ensured the pristine, godlike image of Elvis Presley remained untarnished. They were the silent witnesses to the man behind the myth. And the man was beginning to crumble. They were the ones who knew which doctors to call, the ones who could procure the prescriptions for the pain, the insomnia, the allergies. They were the ones who would gently, or sometimes forcefully, guide a disoriented king back to his room after a concert, shielding his stumbling form from the prying eyes of hotel staff. They were the ones who had to navigate the volatile cocktail of prescription drugs and temper tantrums, trying to keep the ship afloat while the captain was lost in a fog. They weren't just protecting him from the world anymore. They were protecting him from himself. And in doing so, they were protecting the entire enterprise. The concerts, the records, the merchandise, the whole multi-million-dollar empire rested on their ability to maintain the illusion. Their personal lives disintegrated. Marriages fell apart under the strain of a husband who was never home, who belonged to another man. Children grew up seeing their fathers as strangers who appeared for a few days before disappearing back into the king's orbit. The men themselves were caught in a gilded trap. They lived a life of unimaginable luxury, flying in private jets, driving gifted cars, wearing clothes and jewelry worth more than the houses they grew up in. But it was a life on loan. Elvis, in his strange and twisted form of generosity, would lavish them with gifts, but keep them on a relatively modest salary. It was a brilliant, insidious form of control. They had the lifestyle of millionaires, but not the bank accounts. They were utterly, completely dependent on his next whim, his next bonus, his next gift of a car they couldn't afford to maintain on their own. To leave was to step off a cliff, from the pinnacle of luxury, back to the harsh reality of a 9-to-5 world they no longer knew how to navigate. They were trapped by the very dream they were helping to sustain. Rehook. The ultimate test of the vow came in 1976. By then, the cracks in the facade were too large to hide. Elvis's behavior had grown erratic, his paranoia deepening, his physical decline becoming terrifyingly obvious. 3 of his most loyal, longest-serving bodyguards and friends, Red West, his cousin Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, were unceremoniously fired. The reason? They were accused of being too heavy-handed with fans, but the men themselves believed the real reason was their growing concern over Elvis's prescription drug abuse. They had begun to break the other unspoken rule. You see everything, but you say nothing. Their dismissal was brutal, orchestrated by Elvis's father, Vernon. There was no severance pay, no pension. After a lifetime of service, they were cast out, excommunicated from the only world they knew. This was the consequence for questioning the king. This was the penalty for trying to save him. Their firing sent a shockwave through the remaining members of the court. The message was clear. The vow was not about friendship. It was not about love. It was about absolute, unquestioning obedience. Your job was not to save the man. Your job was to serve the king. And the king's reality, however warped, however self-destructive, was the only reality that mattered. The remaining members doubled down, tightening the circle, becoming even more insular, even more protective of the secrets. The isolation became absolute. In those final months, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted from a perpetual party to a permanent wake. The laughter was gone, replaced by hushed whispers and the worried glances of men who knew they were watching a slow-motion catastrophe. The vow took on a new, desperate meaning. It was no longer about keeping the world out. It was about keeping the man inside from completely self-destructing. They became his nurses, his keepers. They would check on him, count his pills, and try to coax him to eat. They would listen to his rambling, paranoid monologues in the dead of night, his fears of betrayal, his loneliness echoing in the grand, empty rooms. They watched as his world shrank until it was nothing more than his bedroom suite upstairs at Graceland. He was a prisoner in his own palace, and they were the guards, standing vigil outside the door. But the line between guard and prisoner had blurred long ago. Who was truly trapped? The man in the room or the men outside, forever bound to his fate? Their own lives suspended? Their own identities subsumed by his? One night, deep in the summer of 1977, the heat was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket over the city. Inside Graceland, the air conditioning hummed its lonely, monotonous tune. The house was quiet. Too quiet. A young Billy Smith, Elvis's cousin and one of the last true confidants, was on duty. He felt it in the air, a stillness that was unnatural, a break in the rhythm that had governed their lives for 2 decades. The rule was simple. The king was not to be disturbed. But another, older instinct was screaming at him. The vow was to never leave him alone, but what did that mean when the silence from behind the door was louder than any shout? What was his real duty? To obey the rules of the court? Or to save the king from the one thing they could never protect him from? The silence. The final, absolute loneliness. He stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his hand frozen on the cold brass of the doorknob to Elvis's private bathroom. Rehook. What happens when the vow of silence is shattered by the ultimate silence? What is the final duty of a Kingsguard when the king is dead? The story we all know is that Elvis Presley was found, an ambulance was called, and the world was told of a tragedy. But the truth, the one whispered between the men who were actually there, is far more complex and far more harrowing. Because in the critical minutes between the moment the door swung open and the first siren wailed in the distance, the vow didn't end. It entered its most crucial, most desperate phase. The first thing that hit them wasn't grief. It was a cold, professional dread. The kind of dread an agent feels when the asset is compromised. The king was dead, but the image, the myth, the multi-billion-dollar corporation that was Elvis, that had to be protected at all costs. The scene inside that bathroom was not the pristine, tragic end befitting a legend. It was messy. It was human. And it was damning. Their training, 2 decades of instinct, kicked in. Before the call was made, before the official story could be conceived, there was a frantic, whispered mission. They had to sanitize the scene. This was the final, unspoken clause of the vow, not just to protect him in life, but to curate the narrative of his death. They moved with a chilling efficiency, their personal shock buried under layers of duty. Everywhere they looked was a landmine. Vials, syringes, prescription bottles from a dozen different doctors under a dozen different names. The very evidence that Red and Sonny West had been fired for trying to stop was scattered around the room like shrapnel. The bitter irony must have hung in the air, thick as the Tennessee heat. They were now hiding the truth that had cost their friends, their careers, their brotherhood. They were erasing the proof that the so-called traitors had been right all along. And then Vernon arrived. The father, the bookkeeper, the man who held the purse strings, and ultimately, the reins of the entire operation. His grief was real, but it was overshadowed by a lifetime of managing the Elvis Presley business. He took one look at the scene, one look at the loyal, frantic men, and gave the silent, authoritative nod. The cleanup was not just approved, it was ordered. This wasn't just about protecting Elvis's reputation from the taint of drug addiction. It was about protecting the estate from lawsuits, from investigations, from the kind of ugly truth that could tarnish the gold plating on the legacy. While the world was just beginning to hear the rumors, while teenagers were crying in the streets and news anchors were fumbling for the right words, the inner circle was engaged in one last act of subterfuge. They presented a carefully managed scene to the paramedics who finally arrived. They crafted the initial story for the press, a story of a heart attack, a sudden, noble end. The vow had always been about maintaining the illusion, and now they were building its final, most important wall, a wall around his memory. But what does an act like that do to a man's soul? To see your best friend, your brother, your hero, lying on the floor, and your first job is to hide his secrets? To essentially lie to the world on his behalf? The grief was there, a roaring monster in their chests, but they had to choke it down. There would be time for that later. Or maybe there wouldn't. Maybe this final act of service would curdle the grief, turning it into something more complicated. Guilt, complicity, a shared secret that would bind them together and isolate them from the rest of the world forever. The vow had always demanded they sacrifice their own lives for his. But in his death, it demanded they sacrifice a piece of their own integrity. They became the primary authors of the myth of his death, a myth that persists to this day. They told the stories of his generosity, his humor, his genius. They left out the late-night ramblings, the paranoia, the terrifying depths of his addiction. Was it loyalty, or was it shame? Were they protecting him, or were they protecting themselves and the life he had given them? The truth is, they hid more than just the drugs. In that room, and in the days that followed, they packed away the evidence of the real Elvis. The man, not the king. His personal books on spiritualism, his handwritten notes, his journals filled with questions about God and the universe and his own purpose. Elvis, in his final years, was a desperate seeker. He was a man drowning in fame, looking for a life raft in esoteric philosophy and late-night gospel sessions. He was profoundly lonely, a prisoner of his own myth, and his private writings were a map of that spiritual prison. To the world, he was the king of rock and roll. To have him revealed as a confused, frightened, desperately searching soul, that was a truth too dangerous for the brand. The brand needed a god, not a man. So they packed the man away in a box and presented the god to the world. This was the most profound betrayal, and perhaps the most profound act of love. They killed the man to save the king. The vow demanded nothing less. For years, the men held the line. Joe Esposito, his foreman and closest friend, became the official gatekeeper of the story. Billy Smith, his cousin, the last true family he had inside the walls, retreated into a quiet, haunted silence. Each man carried the weight of what they did in that room. It informed every interview they gave, every book they wrote, every memory they shared. They were no longer just his friends. They were his apostles, preaching the gospel they had helped to write. Meanwhile, the traitors, the West Cousins and Dave Hebler, were vindicated in the most horrible way imaginable. Their book, released just weeks before his death, was suddenly transformed from a piece of tabloid gossip into a tragic, Cassandra-like prophecy. They had tried to save his life by breaking the vow and telling the truth. The Loyalists had tried to save his legacy by upholding the vow and hiding it. Who were the real heroes of this story? Who were the villains? The line is so blurred it ceases to exist. Both sides were acting out of a twisted form of love and desperation, caught in the impossible gravity of the Elvis Presley supernova. The consequences of that day rippled outwards, defining the rest of their lives. It created a schism in the group that never fully healed. Those who were on the inside on August 16th shared a bond that no one else could ever penetrate. They were the ones who saw the end. They were the ones who closed the book. But this shared secret was also a poison. It led to decades of hushed arguments, of accusations and defenses, of men trying to reconcile their love for their friend with the lies they had to tell for him. Think of the burden. Imagine knowing the truth of one of the most famous deaths in modern history. Imagine carrying the secrets of an icon in your head every single day for the rest of your life. The journalists, the biographers, the fans, they could all speculate, but these men knew. They knew what books were by his bed, what music was in his cassette player, what he said in his final, rambling conversations. They knew the smell of the room, the weight of the silence. Their lives became a performance, in a way. They were no longer just men. They were living exhibits in the Elvis Museum. Their identities were permanently fused to his. They would forever be introduced not by their own names, but as Elvis's best friend, Elvis's cousin, Elvis's bodyguard. The vow that was supposed to last his lifetime ended up lasting theirs. They were still on the payroll, not in dollars but in identity. They were still serving the king, long after the man was gone. But the story doesn't end with the sanitizing of a room and the preservation of a legacy. Because a secret that powerful, shared between that many men, can't stay buried forever. It mutates. It leaks. Over the years, fragments of the truth have emerged in memoirs and late-night interviews, hints of a more complicated story. But one detail remains shrouded in mystery. A secret within a secret. Something so personal and potentially damaging that even the most forthcoming of the members would only allude to it in whispers. It has nothing to do with drugs or women. It has to do with a box. A small, metal lockbox that Elvis reportedly kept in his office. A box that some say contained his truest and darkest self. This wasn't a box of financial documents or contracts. The legend among the inner circle is that this box contained audio tapes, not of music, but of conversations. Late-night, drug-fueled, rambling confessions, and paranoid accusations Elvis had secretly recorded. Conversations with his inner circle, with his family, with his lovers. Some believe he even recorded his own private monologues, a diary of a man losing his grip on reality. It was his insurance policy, his black book, the ultimate weapon of control over everyone in his orbit. The contents of that box could have destroyed careers, ruined families, and irrevocably shattered the myth of the benevolent king. And on August 16, 1977, in the chaos and confusion of that terrible afternoon, the box vanished. Who took it? Was it Vernon? In one last, desperate act to control the narrative? Was it one of the Memphis Mafia, trying to protect himself and his brothers from whatever secrets were on those tapes? Or was it taken by someone else entirely? A ghost in the machine, who slipped in and out of Graceland amidst the pandemonium. The mystery of the missing box is the final, hidden chapter in the story of the vow. Because if that box and those tapes still exist somewhere, then the story of Elvis Presley and the men who swore to protect him is not over. The biggest secret of all may still be out there, waiting. But what if it isn't just waiting? What if part of it has already been found? In 2017, an anonymous seller attempted to auction a single, unmarked cassette tape online. The claim? It was one of the legendary lost tapes. The listing was gone within hours. Pulled down by the auction site? Or withdrawn by a seller who got spooked, realizing they were holding a stick of cultural dynamite? Like the box itself, the tape simply vanished, leaving behind only a blurry screenshot and 1,000 new questions. It was never verified, never authenticated. Another ghost in the machine, another whisper in the long, dark corridor of the Elvis Presley mythology. Most serious biographers dismiss the box and its contents as pure folklore, a gothic tale spun to add another layer of tragedy to the king's demise. They argue there's no concrete evidence, only the shifting, unreliable memories of men who had every reason to embellish. But in the world of Elvis Presley, the legend has always been more powerful than the facts. The truth is what you can get people to believe, and perhaps that is the final, most profound secret of all. The contents of the box, real or imagined, almost don't matter. What matters is the silence that surrounds it, a silence that became the last echo of the vow. A vow that chained these men to a memory, forcing them to spend the rest of their lives curating a legend while burying the complicated, flawed, and deeply human man they once called their friend. We have built a global empire on the image of Elvis, a smiling, hip-swiveling, jump-suited deity, an American dream in a gilded cage. The truth of his final years, the pain, the paranoia, the profound loneliness, is an inconvenient footnote. A secret on a tape, in a box that may never have existed, is a threat to the entire enterprise. Maybe the box vanished because everyone, in their own desperate way, needed it to. They were all still serving the king. The vow was never truly about protecting Elvis the man. By the end, it was about protecting Elvis the king. And in that, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The king lives on, frozen in time, perfect and eternal. But the men who served him, the keepers of the flame and the keepers of the secrets, were left to grow old with his ghosts. Their story is the ultimate cautionary tale of a love so fierce it became a prison, and a loyalty so absolute it demanded the truth be the final sacrifice. The story of Elvis Presley is filled with secrets, triumphs and tragedies, legends and lies, and we are here to uncover all of them, to go beyond the myth and find the man. If you believe these stories must be told, make sure you subscribe to Forever_Elvis_Stories, because the music may have stopped, but the story never will.